Hello everyone, welcome back. We're back with another Power Rankings video. Week 25 of our Power Rankings video. In the last regular season Power Rankings video before we enter into the playoffs. Look to all the updates. I've seen a couple of shiftments in the honorable mentions, a lot of shiftment in the top 10, and we have another new number one, someone who's getting back into the number one spot. We'll get to all of that coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support, it really does help the channel. We're on the road to 500 subscribers, so just don't forget to subscribe, it really does help the channel. And don't forget to leave a comment down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on all that was discussed here today. So in today's video, we've got another Power Rankings video, week 25 of our Power Rankings series. So we've got a lot of interesting things to talk about. We're going to start off, as we usually do, we're talking about our 4 honorable mentions. We saw a lot of shiftment in the honorable mention category from last week, so we'll get to all the updates here. So we're going to start off with the 4th honorable mention, entering into the honorable mention category for the first time in a while, and that is a team who was undefeated last week and remains in the hunt for a playoff spot, and that is the Columbus Blue Jackets. The Jackets are hitting their stride at the right time. Last week and was basically a must-win all their games. They won all their games. They went 4-0-0. They started out the week with a very big victory at home over the Ottawa Senators. Then they were able to narrowly take down the Buffalo Sabres before having back-to-back wins over the East-leading Washington Capitals. So the Jackets, because they are still in the hunt, they and the Montreal Canadiens are still fighting for that last wildcard spot in the East. So because of that, I am going to put the Jackets as my 4th honorable mention. Like I said, they had a really good week this week, staying alive in the playoff hunts, and they remain still within striking distance of a playoff spot. So Jackets looking pretty good offensively. Marchenko, Fantilli, Monahan, Jenner, and Voronkov doing really good offensively. Defensively, Werenski, Fabro, and Severson doing pretty good defensively. And in net, Greaves, who's actually started to play great, the team 3rd stringer, has done a phenomenal job for the Jackets this week. So all in all, it's all week there for the Jackets. They have my 4th honorable mention. My 3rd honorable mention this week was last week's 1st honorable mention, and the only reason I bumped them down is because a couple of other teams had some better weeks ahead of them, and that is the Ottawa Senators. The Senators had a decent week this week. They went 2-1-0, started the week like we just talked about, losing to the Columbus Blue Jackets before the end of the week with a very impressive victory over Montreal, keeping the Jackets alive. And then they also took down the Philadelphia Flyers. They are now locked into the first wildcard spot. They will go to whoever wins the Atlantic Division, whether that be Tampa or Toronto. So interesting out there. It's been a really great season there from Ottawa, and that's why I'm putting those my 3rd team, my honorable mentions. Like, they're not one of the top teams in the NHL at this point, but they are still a really good team. Offensively, the team's still clicking pretty well. Stützle, Giroux, Zetterlund, Cozens, and Batherson doing pretty good offensively. Defensively, guys like Chabot, Jensen, and Clevin doing pretty good defensively. And in net, Allmark and Forsberg gave them pretty good goaltending this week. So all in all, a decent week there from the Sens. They're locked into the first wildcard spot, and they are my 3rd honorable mention. My 2nd honorable mention, and entering into the power rankings this week after they were taken out last week, is the Florida Panthers. They had a very fantastic week. They went 3-1-0. Now at this point, they have already been locked into the 3rd spot in the Atlantic Division, and they will go to whoever winds up getting 2nd in the Atlantic, whether that be Tampa or Toronto. But Florida had a really good week, like I said, going 3-1-0. They started out the week with a win over the Toronto Maple Leafs. Very impressive bounce back game for the Panthers. Then they took down the Detroit Red Wings. They took down the Buffalo Sabres before ending the week with a bad loss, giving up a 2-goal lead to the Rangers 5-3. So it wasn't a great end to the week, but 6 out possible, 8.3 out possible, 4 wins. You like to see that if you're the Florida Panthers. And even though they weren't doing overly great, this team's still doing pretty good offensively. Guys like Bennett, Samoskevich, Rodriguez, Barkov, and Lundell are doing pretty good offensively. Defensively, Forsling, Jones, and Mikola doing pretty good defensively. And in net, both Bobrovsky and Vanecek have done all right this week. So a really solid week there from the Panthers, and even though they're locked into 3rd in the Atlantic, I have them as my 2nd honorable mention. And my 1st honorable mention this week is a team who was red hot up until last week and has now fallen off a little bit, and they're still a question mark for making the playoffs, and that is the St. Louis Blues. After a 12-game winning streak, we saw that come to an end last week. They only had 2 games this week, but lost both of them. They started the week with a narrow 4-3 loss to the Edmonton Oilers, and then they lost in a shootout 4-3 to Seattle. So they got 1 out possible, 4 points. Did not win this week, so that's why I'm bumping them from being in my power rankings last week to being the 1st honorable mention this week. Like, they're they're still in a really good position. They're still projected to probably be a wild card team this year, so I definitely still think the St. Louis Blues will probably make the playoffs, but like they've been slipping as of late and are on a 3-game losing streak, so that's why I'm bumping them down to my first honorable mention. But still, they're a decent team. Offensively, Shen, Kyrou, Buchnevich, Neighbors, Thomas doing really good offensively. Defensively, Fowler, Falk, and Broberg doing pretty good defensively, and in net, Binnington and Hofer have still given them pretty decent goaltending. So all in all, a decent week there from the Blues, but they went 0-1-1, didn't have a win, and that's why I'm bumping them down to my first honorable mention. So those are our 4 honorable mentions. Now going over to my top 10 power rankings for the week 25. So the 10th spot on my power rankings and being bumped down 2 spots from last week is the Carolina Hurricanes. The Hurricanes did not have an overly great week last week. They went 1-2-1, just as the Devils. They're limping into the playoffs. They're currently locked into the 2nd spot in the Metro, have a date with New Jersey for the playoffs this upcoming weekend. So the Carolina Hurricanes are probably resting a whole bunch of players, which is why they're not doing overly good, but still, they did not have an overly great week. They started out the week with a loss to the Buffalo Sabres. Then they lost in a shootout to the Washington Capitals. Now, the Capitals are a good team, so not surprising there. They then destroyed and eliminated the New York Rangers, beating them 7-3 before ending the week with a 4-1 loss to the most likely Atlantic Division winning Toronto Maple Leafs. So all in all, it's a decent week from the Hurricanes. They're at 47-25, locked into 2nd spot in the Metro. So a decent week there, but they only got 1 out of possible 4 wins and 3 out of possible 8 points. So still below 500. Not overly great stuff there from Carolina, but they're in a decent position, and that's why I have them as my 10th team on my power rankings. Offensively, Svechnikov, Aho, Stankov, and Jankowski and Carey doing pretty good offensively. Defensively, Slavin, Burns, and Chatfield doing pretty good defensively. And in net, Anderson and Kochekov have done pretty good in net. So all in all, decent week there from the Hurricanes, but they had a losing record. That's why they're now 10th in my power rankings. 9th in my power rankings, and actually being bumped up 1 spot from last week, is the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Lightning did not have an overly great week this week either. They lost 2 of their 3 games, but had a point in all 3 of them, as they went 1-0-2 this week. They started out the week with an overtime loss to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Then they had an overtime loss to the Detroit Red Wings before they took down the Buffalo Sabres. So they have a point streak going right now, but they have lost a couple of games in extra time. So not overly great stuff there from Tampa, but they're a 46-26-8 record. Still have a slight chance to edge out Toronto for top spot in the Atlantic, although it's looking pretty bleak at this point. So interesting out there, but they got 4 out of possible 6 points, 1 out of possible 3 wins. It's not overly bad, but you still want to see them probably get a win against Detroit or Toronto, but still interesting out there. And they're still a really good team that's going to host a playoff series this year. So interesting out there. Offensively, team's still looking pretty good. Bjorkstrand, Gord, Kucherov, Point, Gensel all looking really good offensively. Defensively, Hedman, Perbix, and Radish doing pretty good defensively. And in net, Vasilevsky and Johansson have done pretty good in net. So all in all, Bolts did all right this week, even though they lost 2 of their 3 games, and that's why I'm bumping them up to 9th in my power rankings. 8th in my power rankings this week, bumping up from being an honorable mention last week, is the Edmonton Oilers. The Oilers had a really stellar week this week. They went 3-1-0. Started out the week with, like we talked about, a very narrow victory over the St. Louis Blues. Then they took down San Jose Sharks. Then they impressively beat the Winnipeg Jets before, in a crucial game and a first-round series preview, they got shut out by the LA Kings, and thus cost them home ice advantage. They will go to Los Angeles in the first round. So just note there, but they did get 3 out of possible 4 wins this week, 6 out of possible 8 points. And even though they're locked in the 3rd in the Pacific now and will have to go to Los Angeles, they are still at a really good 47-29-5 record. So the Oilers are still doing pretty good. They had 3 out of possible 4 wins. Like, that's pretty good for a banged up Edmonton Oilers team. So all in all, decent week there from the Oilers. Offensively, McDavid, Brown, Podkolzin, Janmark, Henrique all doing really good offensively. Defensively, with guys like Bouchard, Nurse, and Kulak doing pretty good defensively. And in net, both Skinner and Picard have done all right this week. So all in all, the Oilers had a stellar week, and even though they're locked in the 3rd Pacific, I bumped them up to 8th in my power rankings. 7th in my power rankings this week is the Colorado Avalanche. They did not have an overly fantastic week. They went 2-2-0. Started the week with a shootout victory over the Vegas Golden Knights. Then they fell at the hands of the Vancouver Canucks, lost a narrow game to the LA Kings 5-4 before ending the week with a 4-2 come from behind victory over the Anaheim Ducks. And that is actually the end of the season for the Colorado Avalanche. They were the first team to finish the 82-game season. They were the first team to have the regular season finished. So just a note there. But the Avalanche now have a 49-29-4 record. They're locked into 3rd spot in the Central. They're going to go to Dallas in the first round, so that'll be an interesting series. But still, it was a decent regular season there from the Hurricanes, especially after starting the season with 4 straight losses. So really good stuff there from the Avalanche. Had a mediocre week, which is why I keep them at the 7th spot, but still pretty solid stuff there from the Avalanche offensively. HS McKinnon, Drew and Lehkonen, Nelson all doing pretty good offensively. Defensively, Taves, McCarr, and Girard doing pretty good defensively. And in net, Blackwood, Wedgwood continue to give them pretty good goaltending. So all in all, a 500 week there from the Avalanche this week, and that is why they are 7th in my power rankings. 6th in my power rankings this week is the Dallas Stars. They were my number 1 team last week, but they were awful this past week. They went 0-3-1. They started out the week with an overtime loss to Vancouver Canucks, had a 3-goal lead with a minute left, blew it. That was an awful loss there from the Stars. They then fell at the hands of the Winnipeg Jets and what they probably needed to win if they wanted to have a shot at the top spot in the Central. Then they lost to Utah, and then they lost to Detroit. So 0-3-1 this week. That's why they're bumping them down to 6 spots on my power rankings. They're at a 50-25-6 record. As we just talked about, they're going to host the Colorado Avalanche in the first round. They're locked into 2nd spot in the Central. So it's interesting stuff there from Dallas, but they are definitely not looking overly good entering the playoffs. Like, this team's still doing pretty good, though. They are one of the top teams in the West and the league, so I'm not going to put them down too much, but still, offensively, team's looking good. Robertson, Marchment, Duchesne, Hintz, and Randon doing really good offensively. Defensively, Bichelle, Harley, and Dumba doing pretty good defensively. And in net, Andre and DeSmith are still doing all right in net, even though it wasn't a great week there from the Stars. So all in all, decent week there from the Stars, but they're still a 50-win team, and I have them as my 6th team in my power rankings. 5th team in my power rankings this week is another team who had a losing record and fell, who was actually quite high last week, and that is the Washington Capitals. The Eastern Conference winning Washington Capitals went 1-0 last week. That's why I'm moving them down a couple spots to 5th spot in my power rankings. They started the week with a very narrow shootout victory over Carolina before losing back-to-back games, which we talked about, to Columbus, and what was basically must-win games there from the Jackets. So they did wind up getting a win. They do have 50 wins on the season. They've already locked up the Eastern Conference and will play the second wildcard team in the East. So interesting note there, they have a 50-21-9 record. So solid stuff there from the Capitals with just a losing record. Right, bump them down a couple of spots. But still, offensively, this team's clicking. Ovechkin, who's only 4 away from 900 goals. Strome, Wilson, Dubois, Mangiapane doing really good offensively. Defensively, Sandin, Chychrun, and Trevor Van Riemsdyk are doing pretty good defensively. And in net, both Lindgren and Thompson did all right this week. So all in all, decent week there from the Caps, and that's why they are 5th in my power rankings, but they did have a losing record. 4th in my power rankings this week is the team who was locked into the 2nd spot in the Pacific Division, and that is the LA Kings. The Kings had a very fantastic week this week. They went 3-0-0. Started out the week with a dominant victory over the Anaheim Ducks, then narrowly beat up the Colorado Avalanche before obliterating the Edmonton Oilers in a first-round preview. They are locked into 2nd in the Pacific Division and will host the Edmonton Oilers this year, so it will be an interesting series nonetheless. 4th consecutive year those two teams have played. They're up to a 47-24-9 record. Can't catch Vegas, and Edmonton can't catch them, so they're locked into 2nd in the Pacific. But still, this team is clicking on all cylinders at the right time. Offensively, Fiala, Kuzmenko, Kempe, Kopitar, Laferriere, all doing quite good offensively. Defensively, with guys like Doughty, Anderson, and Spencer doing pretty good defensively. And in net, Kemper and Riddick continue to give them great goaltending. So all in all, solid week there from the Kings, winning all 3 games. That's why they're up to 4th in my honorable mentions. 3rd in my honorable mentions this week, and on the precipice of winning the Atlantic Division for the first time in their franchise history, is the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Leafs had a fantastic week. They went 3-1-0. They started the week sour by losing to the Florida Panthers, but after that, overtime victory over Tampa, overtime victory over Montreal, and then they took down the Carolina Hurricanes 4-1. So 3 impressive victories over a team who's fighting for a wildcard spot, and 2 teams who are in the top end of the Eastern Conference. They did lose to Florida, but that might have been strategic to make sure that Florida didn't get the first wildcard spot and play them in the first round. So interesting note there, at least up to 50 wins at 50-26-4 record. They are on the verge of actually getting the Atlantic Division title. It's not clinched yet, but it should be over the next couple of days. So interesting note there, but the Leafs are looking lethal, and that's why they're up to 3rd in my power rankings. Offensively, teams clicking. Nyes, Matthews, Marner, Tavares, Nylander, all looking really good offensively. Defensively, Riley, Albright, Larson, and Benoit looking really good defensively. And in net, Wall installers continue to give this team really good goaltending. So all in all, Leafs that's all a week on the precipice of actually clinching the Atlantic, and that's why they're 3rd in my power rankings. 2nd in my power rankings, and have clinched the Pacific Division title yet again, is the Vegas Golden Knights, my favorite team. I'm pushing them up to the 2nd spot in my power rankings, a little bit of bump up from last week. They had a solid week this week. They went 2-0-1. They started the week with a shootout loss to the Colorado Avalanche. Blow lead wasn't overly great, but then they were able to take down the Seattle Kraken 2-1 and Nashville Predators 5-3. So a couple of impressive victories over eliminated teams. Wasn't overly fantastic, but still, It's a couple of interesting wins there for the Vegas Golden Knights. They got a point in all 3 of their games, 5 a possible 6 points, 2 a possible 3 wins. You take that if you're Vegas. They're now locked into the first spot in the Pacific Division. Will take on whoever finishes in the first wildcard spot. They have a 49-22-9 record. Like all season long, this has been a really good season there from Vegas. So all in all, decent week there from the Golden Knights. Offensively, Carlson, Stone, Barbashev, Eichel, and Hurdle all doing really good offensively. Defensively, Hannafin, Whitecloud, and Haig doing pretty good defensively. And in net, Hill and Samsonov continue to give them pretty good goaltending. So all in all, really good week there from the Knights. That's why they're second in my honorable mentions. And re-entering as the #1 team in my power rankings, once again, is the President's Trophy winning Winnipeg Jets. The Jets this week clinched the President's Trophy. They wound up going 2-1-0 this week. Started the week with a very impressive victory over Dallas that basically solidified themselves as the top team in the Central. Then beat Chicago before losing to Edmonton, and because of some of the out-of-town scoreboard help, they were able to clinch the President's Trophy, Western Conference, and Central Division this week. So the Western Conference, the playoffs will really actually run through the Winnipeg Jets. They will face whoever finishes in the second wildcard spot, whether that be St. Louis, Minnesota, or Calgary. They're up to a 55-22-4 record. I mean, this team has been lethal all season long. Offensively, team's still clicking. Shifley, Connor, Ehlers, Perfetti, Iafallo, all doing really good offensively. Defensively, Pionk, Morrissey, Shen doing pretty good defensively. And in net, both Hellebuck and Comrie continue to give them pretty good goaltending. So in all, another solid week from the Jets, and they're back up to first in my power rankings. Definitely, that's all I'm going to talk for today. Just to remind you guys, I did wind up taking 2 teams out from last week's power rankings and putting 2 new teams in. So New Jersey, who was 3rd in my honorable mention last week, and Montreal, who was 4th in my honorable mention last week, I took out, and I put Florida, who's now 2nd honorable mention, and Columbus, who's now 4th honorable mention, both into the power rankings this week. But just to recap, here's my top 10 power rankings for this week of the NHL season. So at the 10th spot, you have Carolina. 9th spot is Tampa. 8th spot is Edmonton. 7th spot is Colorado. 6th spot is Dallas. 5th spot is Washington. 4th spot is LA. 3rd spot is Toronto, 2nd spot is Vegas, and the first team in my power rankings yet again, and coming back for the first time in a while, is the Winnipeg Jets. Definitely, that's all I'm going to talk for today. I left you guys thoughts. They paid one too high, they paid one too low, and if you had to give me your power rankings for this point in time, I'd love to hear what you guys thought. Definitely love to hear your thoughts on all of that down in the comment section below. That was all I'm going to talk for today. Remember to like this video, and if you'd like to subscribe below, it definitely helps with the channel, and we're on the road to 500 subscribers. And don't forget to leave a comment down in the comment section below as well. I also have a blog, comment news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that, so check that out. I'll link to that in the description below, and I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.